Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute Next Round podcast. I'm Tim Anaya, PRI's Vice President of Marketing and Communications, and your podcast co-host. This week we have a terrific guest, Sacramento County District Attorney Thien. You may remember him as a past speaker at PRI's California Ideas in Action Conference in Sacramento, and he's just written a fascinating new book called The People versus the Golden State Killer, which you can get at your favorite online bookseller. And it's a really interesting story giving you a behind-the-scenes look at the capture and prosecution of the notorious Golden State Killer. And it's told through the eyes of District Attorney Ho, who himself is a former refugee and overcame a lot of adversity to become Sacramento County's top elected prosecutor. And he tells the story in a very interesting way, kind of weaving through his story and life experiences along with what happened in the case, and also remembering and focusing on the victims and the loved ones left behind. So it's a really powerful and important story, and we chat in our conversation about the case, how he got involved in the case, some of the interesting aspects of the case, such as the fact that Joseph DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, served as a law enforcement officer after and during the time of his crimes. We talk about that. We talk about he also had put on performances during the prosecution, during the interviewing of him, kind of passed himself off as having a multiple personalities disorders. So we talk about all the aspects of the case. We talk about the district attorney's passion for fighting for justice for victims of crime. And we talk about, well, really, what are the policy changes that we should be considering all these years later based on his experiences prosecuting the Golden State Killer. So if you're looking for a very interesting book to read, a very powerful book to read, this book is for you. I think you'll enjoy our conversation very much. So stay tuned. After the break, we'll have my conversation with Sacramento County District Attorney Thien. Thank you so much for listening. Join PRI February 19th, 2026 in Sacramento for our annual California Ideas in Action Conference. Every year, PRI brings together some of the top free market thinkers in the state and the country to talk about how market-based reforms can pave the way for more political balance in the state and address some of the state's nagging challenges. This year, we have some terrific speakers lined up, including one of California's top reformers, San Jose Mayor Matt Mann, as our keynote luncheon speaker. You'll also hear from chef and food entrepreneur and newly appointed Huntington Beach City Councilman Andrew Gruhl as our kickoff speaker. You'll also hear policy experts discuss how to address the state's ongoing insurance crisis, and you'll hear from some of California's top journalists and opinion writers about all things politics in 2026. So RSVP today at pacificresearch.org/events to guarantee your spot for probably the top free market conference in California every year, PRI's California Ideas in Action Conference, February 19th, 2026 at the Sutter Club. Go to pacificresearch.org/events to join us in Sacramento. Well, Thien, welcome back to PRI's Next Round podcast. It's great to have you back.
Well, thank you so much for having me on your show. I always enjoy it, most definitely.
Well, it's great to have you on to talk about your fascinating new book. You know, we love books at PRI. We always do our holiday book list every year, and I may have found my entry for the 2026 holiday book list. The People versus the Golden State Killer, which our listeners who are interested can buy a copy of at their favorite online booksellers. And I think to start, I approach reading your book as someone who's written my own books, work in media and communications and editing. I was really impressed with the way that you just set up the story, kind of weaving in your upbringing, your life as a prosecutor, and then the story of the case. It's even really a story of kind of Sacramento emerging over the past, 3 or 4 decades. So maybe let's start with a 30,000-foot view question. Why did you decide to tell this story, and why was it so important for you to kind of tell your story in parallel with your own life experiences and maybe the story of a changing Sacramento region as well.
So I think one of the things that I've noticed about the true crime genre is that it tends to focus on the criminal and the crimes. And so what I wanted to do was change the focus and really placed it on the generation of law enforcement officers on this case that never gave up the search for the Golden State Killer. And I also wanted to focus on the survivors because at the end of the day, the survivors needed to make sure that we amplified their voices and made sure that their stories were told and not lost in the fascination, the macabre fascination with murder and crime. And that's really what I wanted to do. And in terms of the way I set up the book, Tim, I'm sure most of your listeners have watched the movie The Titanic. In The Titanic, there's the A, the B, and the C story. The A story is the search for the Hope Diamond. The B story is the love story between Leo and Kate, and the C story is the sinking of the Titanic. And so here, the A story is about the investigation, the capture, and the prosecution of the Golden State Killer, the East Area Rapist. The B story is about my story, and the C story is about the survivors. And so I wanted to weave that in, jumping back and forth in time from when the crime occurred to when the prosecution occurred, when we arrested him. So that was my vision really for the book.
So before we get into some of what you write about and the case itself, let's talk a little bit about you and your passion for justice. When listeners read the book and read your story, they learn about, your being a refugee, overcoming so much to become Sacramento County's elected district attorney.
Mhm.
And so, in reading it, it kind of struck me, how did serving the people and really you can just tell from your words, your passion for ensuring justice for all, how did that become your life's work and how did your life's experience influence your work on this case?
When I was 4 years old, my parents and I, along with my younger brother, escaped Vietnam in a fishing boat. And obviously, this is after the fall of Saigon, after the communists came in. They arrested my uncle, who worked for the South Vietnamese government. Without a judge, without a jury, without a prosecutor, the communist government sent him to a re education camp where he was tortured and starved for 7 years. And so, 1976, my family decided to escape on a fishing boat. We were lost at sea, ran out of gas, food, and water, just drifting on the ocean until we were rescued. I spent 6 months in a refugee camp. And when I came to this country, I couldn't speak a word of English. I always joke around that I learned how to speak English by watching Bugs Bunny cartoons. 20 years, 20 years later, graduated from law school. And I've always believed that America and California, we are the country and the state of people for second chances. And when you have a second chance at life, I feel that you need to earn it because of all that sacrifice. And there's no better way to earn it than to really be a servant of the community. And as a prosecutor, we serve and we protect victims in society. And so that really just kind of led me to that position and that job because it's about service, it's about giving back, it's about earning it.
So let's get into the story. As a longtime Sacramento resident, I've been here almost 30 years.
Hmm.
I remember the day when that announcement was made, and it was shocking. I mean, literally, people's jaws dropped. Set the stage for us a little bit. Who was Joseph DeAngelo, who we learn in the book was known by many nicknames and ultimately the Golden State Killer? And why, in your view, did his ultimate capture prove so elusive over the years?
So when you're talking about the Golden State Killer, you're talking first about the Visalia ransacker, the East Area Rapist, the East Bay Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and the Golden State Killer. Just those monikers gives you an idea on the geographical scope of his crime. He committed 13 known murders, upwards of 50 sexual assaults, 120 burglaries in 11 different counties from 1974 to 1986. And then he disappeared into the dark, into the night. And nobody knew who he was. We uploaded the DNA to the databases, CODIS, the national database. Nothing, not a single hit. No clues, no idea. Every fingerprint, every DNA test, every serology. everything came up blank for almost 30 plus years. And so he was this boogeyman, this boogeyman of our childhood. He was this phantom, this mystical figure. And so I think when we caught him 40 years later after he started his crime spree, it captures people's attention because he affected so many communities. And he was able to escape capture, I think in large part for two reasons. Number one was he was a police officer during a significant portion of his crime. So he knew the police tactics. He knew how long it would take the police to arrive on scene. He knew all the ingress and egress points of location where the police blockades would be. He had inside knowledge. And on top of it, the second reason is back in the 70s and the 80s, people were really siloed, the law enforcement. I mean, Sacramento wasn't talking to Santa Barbara. Santa Barbara wasn't talking to Contra Costa. Contra Costa wasn't talking to Orange County. And so he was able to slip in and out of these different jurisdictions committing his crimes. And nowadays we have forensic DNA, we have ring cameras and license plate readers. He wouldn't be able to commit the crimes today that he committed back then. But I think it captures the community's attention because of just the nature of his crimes and how long he went before we caught him.
How did you ultimately become the prosecutor of one of America's most notorious serial predators? And what was going through your mind that day when you were assigned to this case? And how did you kind of view this case as you set out to prosecute Joseph DeAngelo?
I prosecuted sex crimes for many years against children, against adults, serial rapists. And I prosecuted gang crimes. I was on homicides for many years. And I ran our homicide and our gang narcotic team as well, our gang narcotic teams as well. And so my first homicide was in Rancho Cordova. On New Year's Day, they found the body of Rajneet Singh half clothed behind a brick wall in the drizzling rain. And I prosecuted that case, my first murder case. And on the way out to the crime scene, as I was preparing for trial, I first learned about the East Area rapist. And I had never asked for a case in my life. Whatever case is put on my desk, that's the case I take. But I said to the detective at the time and my fellow prosecutor, like, look, if they ever caught this guy, this is the only case I would ask for. Fast forward 6 years later, they caught the Golden State Killer. And they hadn't signed the case for like a week plus. And so I walked into my supervisor's office, the head of homicide, and I said, look, Rod, that's his name, Rod. And I said, Rod, if you're on SEAL Team 6 and they told you they found Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, you know what you say? And he grinned and looked at me and he says, what? I said, you say, I want on that helicopter ride. And so I looked at the case file and I tapped the file and I said, I want on this helicopter ride. 2 hours later, I was assigned the case. And it's been an honor of a lifetime to work on the case. And ultimately, my overall vision, and this case had 3 million pages of police reports. It had endless, tens of thousands of suspects. The volume of the case was unimaginable. But at the end of the day, my number one focus and our number one focus as the prosecution team was to make sure that all the victims, every single one of them, received justice and their day in court.
We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know. So the prosecution of Joseph DeAngelo, as you take readers through in the book, it was a very complicated case. And it involved a lot of hard work by dedicated law enforcement, both in your office and out in the field.
Mm-hmm.
Share with our listeners some of that, all these unsung heroes in the case. Share with our listeners some of the important work that law enforcement did, both before and finding DeAngelo and during the trial that ultimately went into convicting him?
Well, I'll give you an example. I mean, when you look at it, we had four generations of officers looking for him. We had some police officers and detectives that retired from the force, and then they became private investigators, and they're snooping around people's garbage cans, on a potential suspect after they retired. People just, they never gave up. And so back in 2018, 2017, and 18, Paul Hose, who's now retired, he was a criminalist and a cold case investigator out of the Contra Costa District Attorney's Office. He came up with an idea to use genetic genealogy. And what that is, if you use 23andMe, Ancestry.com, you take this swab in your mouth, you send it over to the Ancestry site. They convert your DNA profile to what they call a SNP profile, a single nucleotide polymorphism. It measures 1 million different areas in your chromosome. And then it uploads that data file into their database. And they compare it to all the other SNP profiles. The more places you have in common with somebody, the more closely related you are. So we uploaded his profile, his SNP profile. We were able to obtain one through some semen found at a crime scene, and created a SNP profile, uploaded it, and we found a distant relative to the Golden State Killer. So now investigators in my office, Kirk Campbell, Monica Jakowski, they created this massive family tree along with the FBI that had thousands of names on it. And so now they had to go through and collate, okay, of these thousand names, how many are white? How many are male? How many had blue eyes? How many were cops or in the military or lived in Sacramento, Orange County, in Southern California, and Contra Costa? And we were able to narrow it down to 3 names. And one of those 3 lived in Sacramento. So they collected his trash on the day he put out his trash. And the last item that our crime lab tested was a piece of tissue. And that tissue came back to all the rapes and murders in Orange County, in Ventura County, and 2 in Santa Barbara, along with Contra Costa. We finally found him. And so that was the unsung heroes who never gave up the search to find him.
To me, one of the strangest aspects of this case, and you've mentioned, is that DeAngelo worked for years as a police officer, and later he was a mechanic. And it begs the question, how on earth was a notorious serial killer able to serve in law enforcement? Maybe you could walk through how did he slip through the cracks here in leading this, double life? And how did his law enforcement background complicate your work in the prosecution and all these law enforcement heroes who tried to track him down over the years?
I think, first of all, the way we do our law enforcement, the way they do their hiring today is vastly different than how they did it in 1974, how they did it in 1975. I mean, in this day and age, you have to go through a background check. Oftentimes, you have to go through a polygraph. Um, let's just say that back in 1974 and 75, those things were never, if rarely, used. And so it's much easier back then to slip through the cracks, and the standards were different then. And so, I don't think he would become a law enforcement officer in this day and age because there'd be so many red flags in his background. I mean, he was committing burglaries as kids. Some of the people that he was involved in, he was committing crimes early on, animal abuse, different things like that. And, he felt really powerless in his life. And so, because of that, he wanted to exert the ultimate power over other people. The law applied to other people, but not to him when he was a police officer. He could do what he wanted in people's homes when he had them tied up. It was this God complex. But in terms of his experience in law enforcement, like I said, it made it challenging to catch him. And in terms of the prosecution of the case, and we saw a little glimpse of this, he was trying to set up a mental health defense. When we caught him and interrogated him, he tried to create this mental health defense around a split personality, or what we call dissociative identity disorder, where he blamed this alternative personality named Jerry for committing the crimes. And he was saying things like, I didn't want to do it, but he forced me to do it. And I had to push him out. And when I did, I lived a good life. Um, And so he had this little inkling of trying to create this defense. But what he didn't realize was that the defense that he created really didn't meet the elements of an insanity defense in California because he knew the wrongfulness of his conduct. And that's why he tried to push Jerry out. So, the little bit of knowledge he had didn't serve him well at the end.
And I find it very chilling when you go through in the book and you recount all of these personality changes and the performances that he put on, both as you're interrogating him and also in the courtroom. So take us inside the head of a prosecutor when you're facing such unpredictable behavior at the key moment. Because I think anybody who works in public service, in media, public affairs, right, you always want to be prepared for any outcome. That's your mantra, what you always aspire to. But here, this is the unpredictable of the unpredictable. How did you prepare yourself to deal with, these evolving personalities and these performances and rebut this staged behavior that he was displaying?
Well, when we arrested him and he was in the booking cell, he put his head down and he rammed against the wall. So if you look at his booking photo, it's red at the top. That's from dried blood. And so one of the things we did was we put him in a cell that had a camera inside the cell. So I literally have video of him. He in court is sitting in a wheelchair. His mouth is agape. He's breathing like a fish out of water, flopping on the ground and barely responsive to the judge. But I have video of him walking into his cell with his cane. And like the character in The Usual Suspect, the moment he gets into that cell, right, where he thinks he's away from prying eyes, he drops the cane. He's doing jumping jacks. He's climbing up and down, So it was performative. It was manipulation. He is and was the master manipulator. So how do we counter that? We counter that through, through the surveillance cameras in his cell. We did that through really exploring and talking to his family, his friends, his coworkers, really trying to paint a picture of him so that we could present to the jury um, the true Joseph DeAngelo, the manipulator.
So obviously, this case got a lot of media attention, not only in the Sacramento region, but nationwide. And, when we see these major cases that are so prominent in the media, sometimes they take on a life of their own. So, how are you able to set aside the great media scrutiny that this case got and still effectively prosecute the case? How did you keep this, kind of media sensationalism from affecting what was going on in the courtroom during the trial?
I had handled a lot of high profile cases before this one, but really nothing prepares you for it. I remember the first court appearance. I was walking out and literally we were surrounded by the media and they were walking along with us, with their camera in your, and the microphone in your face, ask you questions. And as prosecutors, you really can't comment on a case that is pending. Um, and so that created quite a dilemma. And they were all there at every court appearance, every single time there was something going on. And so there was this media circus, and people were blogging about it. They were on Reddit. They were, uh, doing all sorts of stuff on it. And so one of the things is while we couldn't give a public statement outside the courtroom, I made sure that if I wanted a message delivered, I would say it on the record in the courtroom and the media would take it down. And so there was a way to frame the message. There was a way to frame the case. There was a way to get that message out. As long as it was in the courtroom on the record, we'd be fine.
So you've mentioned it several times here, and I think reading your book, what really impressed me was your intent to make the book about the victims and the survivors and the loved ones left behind, rather than sensationalizing the killer. And I know, we've had a chance, fortunately, to talk with, crime victims like you may know Bob Spano, and he
Uh-huh.
shared his stories of, I believe, his sister was murdered and kind of what they went through. And it seems talking to him and reading books like yours, it seems like we too often forget the victims and what they're going through and, in the telling of the stories like this. So why was it so important for you in writing this book to try and change this narrative here and really focus on the victims?
So, portion of the proceeds of the book goes to support a nonprofit called Phyllis's Garden. And Phyllis's Garden is a nonprofit started by survivors to support survivors. And Phyllis was the very first rape victim in Sacramento. I met her in court. She always sat in the front row. We always chatted before court. Near the end of the case, she couldn't be in court because she was fighting cancer. She was not able to make it to the plea. And so when it was time for him to admit to committing the crime against her, all the other victims stood up for her. 2 months later, when DeAngelo is about to be sentenced, I look across the courtroom and I see Phyllis sitting there. And she's got this twinkle in her eye. For the first time in 40 years, she was able to obtain a measure of justice. 3 months later, she passed away from cancer. And so when I think of the case, I always think of her. And that's why we obtain and try to fight for justice. Because if the case had gone on further, she would have never obtained that measure of justice that we were able to give her.
So as we close, your book is ultimately a story of really fascinating prosecution, but it's also a bit of a snapshot of, 30 plus years of evolving criminal justice policy in California and public safety funding challenges and technological evolution. So as you look back on the case, are there any policy changes that you think are important for lawmakers even today to consider that would give or make it easier for prosecutors to bring serial killers like Joseph DeAngelo to justice and ensure that justice is served for the family members and loved one left behind in other cases that may occur in the future?
I think one of the things that we did for the first time ever was the use of genetic genealogy to solve these cold cases. And since then, nearly 1,000 cases around the world have been solved using this technique. And we developed best practices in regards to the use of genetic genealogy because we want to make sure it's not abused. And I think some of the issues here is, um, there are those that, and we've seen in other states like New York that try to really inhibit law enforcement's ability to use genetic genealogy to investigate these cases. And then additionally, we constantly struggle with recruitment and retention because there's such a negative perception by sometimes the media in regards to law enforcement and the lack of funding that we have as well. So those are some of the challenges we face. But I think for the most part, we have fantastic prosecutors in my office that work really hard to to bring justice to victims every day. And regardless of the resources, we will keep moving forward that ultimate mission.
Well, Tien Ho, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about your terrific book, which our listeners can find at their favorite online booksellers, wherever they like to get books. And how can our listeners, who are interested in kind of following more of what you and your office are doing, how can they follow along at home with what you're doing and keep up to date with your good work?
So they can, really check out our Facebook page, which is, Sacramento District Attorney on Facebook, and we have updates on a lot of things that we do. So please sign up and follow us and subscribe and really keep up to date. And appreciate the opportunity to be on your show.
Well, thank you so much and best of luck. Hope you sell 1 million copies of a
Yeah.
great book.
Thank you, Tim. I appreciate it.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.